Then let me welcome everyone to today's Science and Values in Climate Risk Management webinar series. I'm Nancy Tawana, one of the faculty members involved in the Rock Ethics Institute Climate and Sustainability Ethics Initiative. As part of this initiative and in collaboration with the Center for Climate Risk Management, and with the leadership of Casey Helgeson and the support of Klaus Keller and Rob Nicholas, we've put together this speaker series designed to provide insights in the interrelations of science and values in climate risk management. In case you haven't been to one of these before, we often start by explaining our terms. Excuse me. Climate risk management is a broad umbrella term that refers to strategies involved in mitigating climate risk, both through slowing down climate change, through sustainable development or green technologies, as well as adapting to the changes that are already happening or that will happen. These decisions require good science to understand the systems involved and consider future projections, but they also require difficult trade-offs that impact both people and ecosystems, and thus often require attention to the ethical import of decision options, as well as considerations of what people so impacted value. This series was designed to feature speakers whose work advances attention to the integration of science and values. Before I introduce our speaker today, let me share with you some information about the format. We'll go for an hour, so we'll end right at 5. After I introduce our speaker today, Professor Lusk will speak for about 40 minutes and will reserve the last approximately 15 minutes for question and answer. So let me begin with a brief introduction to our speaker. Professor Lusk is a philosopher who studies the methodology and epistemology of socially relevant science. He investigates the production, dissemination, and use of scientific data, particularly within climate science. He's an assistant professor at Michigan State University, jointly appointed in Lyman Briggs College in the Department of Philosophy. One of his aims in his research is to speak specifically to scientific practitioners who might benefit from philosophical insights. As we've gathered together today, an audience in this virtual room that spans scientists and philosophers, I look forward to his insights and the dialogue his talk will catalyze.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for inviting me to be part of this series. Originally this was in person before the small little pandemic hit. And I really wish that I could be there because as a graduate student, I was part of a Scrims summer school that took place at Penn State. And I think that was in summer of 2014, a while ago. And that was really a formative experience for me. It provided a great model of what philosopher and scientist collaboration might look like, and one that subsequently informed my collaborations going forward. That I was collaborating with climate scientists as a philosopher was something that grew out of that Scrims summer school. So thanks both for the opportunity to speak today and for encouraging the work of interdisciplinary scholars like myself. So when I was originally asked to speak, I was asked to give a work in progress, and I didn't want to disappoint, even though Zoom recordings might create a lasting record of my nascent ideas. So with that caveat, here's an outline of the talk that I'm going to give today. I'm going to first discuss one way that social or contextual values, I'm going to use those two phrases interchangeably, enter into climate science analyses via inductive risk. I'm then going to present an account which I've developed with Wendy Parker, who will be a speaker in the series later on, of how to manage inductive risk via appeals to the values of climate science information users. And I'm then going to problematize that account by examining its potential deployment in democratic institutions, in a democratic society. Most of this talk is going to end up like setting up a problem that I see. And at the end, though, I will propose a potential solution. That's where most of the work in progress comes. And yes, if you've just realized that what I'm doing is I'm giving my own work and then giving an objection to that work and then trying to solve that objection, you're doing a good job following along. That's going to be basically the way the talk goes today. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with this term inductive risk, it's going to be a central concept that I discuss. And it is simply the risk of erring when accepting a conclusion. It is the risk of making a wrong inference. Now, these errors are classically understood scientifically as rejecting a true hypothesis or accepting a false one. These are errors that we might make in reasoning, but they can also be understood a different way as underestimating or overestimating a particular quantity of interest. And I think this second usage is going to be easier to understand in the context of climate science. Now, methodological choices made in the course of scientific research can steer inductive risk one way or another. It can increase the chance of certain kinds of errors, or it could decrease the chance of certain other kinds of errors. The classical example is the choice of statistical significance one needs. Though it's often set conventionally, the choice of a level of statistical significance balances the chance of mistakenly accepting a true hypothesis with that of mistakenly rejecting the hypothesis as false, right? There are multiple sites within the practice of climate science where inductive risks can arise. For example, there's often significant uncertainty about which information sources are the most accurate, especially in the case of model projections. For many variables of interest, there may be no strong scientific grounds for thinking that one projection, for example, will be significantly more accurate than others. Similarly, for selecting which scenario we are likely to face or which greenhouse gas emission pathways should be employed when making projections, which impact models are the right ones to use, and which analysis methods are the correct ones may have similar issues. And I won't go through all of these, but the point is, at each juncture, the choices made may change the inductive risk profile. The decisions made could make certain kinds of errors, over underestimation of a quantity or underestimation of the quantity, more or less likely. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that every decision does this. Sometimes we have a good grip on the error characteristics. We know what kind of decision we're making. But at other times, we may be uncertain about which choices are best from the perspective of knowledge production, from an epistemic perspective. Inductive risk, for many philosophers, invites social values into scientific decisions. A number of philosophers have argued that contextual values, and when I say that, I mean social, ethical, political, or personal values, and I'll use that equivalently, or maybe I'll just use social values, that social values can be appropriate when managing this inductive risk. These philosophers include many of my current colleagues, including Kevin Elliott, who I believe is the next speaker in the series to follow me. And I'll get back to him later, but I'll talk about another colleague, Heather Douglas. She contests that contextual values, these social values, can appropriately steer methodological decisions under certain conditions. And these are the three conditions that she thinks must be met for social values to come into play. First, it is uncertain which method would produce the most accurate results or conclusion. Second, different options can be foreseen to affect the balance of risk differently. And then third, some errors would have particularly negative consequences. And this is where the value judgment comes into play. It's in judging what those negative consequences are. In these cases, these philosophers think scientists ought to choose the methodology that avoids errors that can be seen to have these particularly bad consequences. Essentially, what social values do here is they play the role of a tiebreaker. Where unforced methodological choices exist, which can't be determined on scientific merit alone, contextual values can permissibly steer those decisions one way or another. They should steer scientific decisions, these philosophers claim, because of a moral obligation that every human being, including scientists, have to protect each other from harm. A simple example will help put this all together and see how this might operate. Say that a scientist faces uncertain methodological choice, and this could be about any of the things that I previously mentioned for climate science, the choice of models when multi-model ensembles aren't possible. It could be about which scenarios. But to simplify things, imagine the choice between two observation instruments, A and B, which monitor toxic air pollutants. While both A and B are good instruments, scientists have reason to believe that A has a higher risk of underestimating the concentrations, where B has a higher risk of overestimating these concentrations. On the inductive risk view that I've just been discussing, scientists should consider the consequences of these potential errors in making their decisions between the choice of instrument A or B. For example, the risk of underestimating toxic air pollutants might lead to insufficient mitigation, which in turn leads to adverse health effects. Whereas the risk of overestimating would lead to unnecessary mitigation and economic losses. To make a decision about A or B, then, scientists should do so, or they should make this decision in light of the impact of these errors. That is, in this example, at least according to Heather Douglas, they should choose B, right? To avoid the possibility of insufficient mitigation and harms to humans, because compared to this, economic losses would be preferable. Just to remind everyone, though, that these social values can only guide decisions when there's genuine methodological uncertainty, when both A and B seem like genuine methodological options. Only then could the social values about health and human effects and economics sway people one way or another. They play the role of a tiebreaker. Now, a lot of times I give talks like this one that suggest social values should play an intimate role in science and climate science in particular. And I am immediately questioned by climate scientists. They claim that this is politicizing science, as if it wasn't already political. But I think that there is a growing acknowledgement among climate scientists, and I think those here at Penn State may be leading this charge, as well as climate scientists working in an area called climate services, that social values need to be taken into account in analyses. There's this great paper by Adams et al., this white paper, which fully acknowledges the moral responsibility that climate service providers have to consider, the moral responsibility of climate service providers, that they need to consider the consequences of their actions. And when I say climate services, I just mean a group of climate scientists whose job is specifically to produce climate information for political decision making. Yet, even amongst groups like Adams et al., the manner in which these social values should be considered or how they come into play is often it's left unspecified. This underspecification leaves a particularly important question unanswered. Acknowledging that social values should play a role in managing inductive risk, that such values should help guide scientific decision-making, raises an important question. Whose values or which values are the ones that should be employed? After all, even in the simple example of a choice between observation instruments that I just gave, it seems acceptable, perhaps, that someone would choose, in some instances, economic savings over human health. Is that really permissible? In order to know, we need to answer this question. Whose values are those that should guide these unforced methodological decisions? Notice that there are a number of ways one could select the contextual values that are used in these uncertain methodological decisions to manage inductive risk. One could, for example, claim that one should appeal to a substantive notion of the good when making these unforced methodological decisions. On this view, the philosophic project, and in part the scientific one, should be to investigate the good and find the right values to be used in these contexts. Another option is just to let individual scientists employ their own values. They are experts, after all, on topics, pretty passionate about them. And if like a reasonable pluralism exists among the scientists, then the outcome might produce a useful range of information. Then there's the democratic view that values should be those of the people. I'm going to come back to this a bit later. There's also some other answers in the philosophical literature at the moment. Many of these combine some features of the views I've just mentioned. For example, one could combine the intuition that one should appeal to a substantive notion of the good with the democratic view and have some scientists do the labor. And Philip Kitcher has a view that's not unlike this one. In a paper written with Wendy Parker that appeared in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society last year in 2019, we advanced a different view of whose values should be employed to manage inductive risk. This paper was written specifically for climate service providers. And I just explained what they are, but to reiterate, for those that aren't familiar here, it is essentially, climate services is essentially the production of climate information specifically tailored to decision making. But the solution we offered in that context, it's entirely general. You can generalize it. Was the values of those that will use the information that results from climate analyses should be those that guide inductive risk management. This seemed somewhat natural to us, especially in the context of climate services, the provision of climate information. Oftentimes, it's described as a service because there is a service being provided to a user. Insofar as a user is hiring a provider to provide a service, it seemed natural to us that user values should be those that inform any kind of risk analysis. Here is the user engaged account. That's what I'm calling it, which Wendy and I gave in that paper, which specifies how providers might appeal to user values to manage inductive risk. This is what we hoped they might be interested in doing. First, learn, collaborate with users to discover which types of errors would be especially undesirable by understanding the user's contextual and social values. Second, recognize which uncertain choices are those that will change the risk of such errors. Then third, consult with users to choose the option that lowers or balances the risk of the errors they find undesirable. And then, although we didn't put it in the graphic that we used in that paper, there should have been a fourth thing that we described, and that is to disclose. So in communicating the results, be transparent about the methodological choices made and the values that informed them. So this is what I'm calling the user-engaged account. What's nice about this picture is that it aligned with how climate service providers were tending to operate. Here's an example of how the user-engaged approach might work in broad strokes, which takes inspiration from an actual study. In 2009, the Bureau of Reclamation in the 7 Colorado River Basin states set out to study the range of conditions they could face in the Colorado River Basin water supply in years and decades to come. They used hydrology and river flow tools to estimate variations in water supply, data sets from climate models to evaluate potential future temperature, precipitation, and moisture conditions, and projections of how many more people would live in those desert states in decades to come as they are growing in population. To capture the quote-unquote human dimensions of future water supply and demand, the Bureau and basin states partnered with the stakeholders, including tribes, conservation groups, and water users, in an inclusive process to help guide the choices that would be made in the study. This process is something we liked. So in this example, the water managers in Nevada faced infrastructure and other kinds of decisions. But in particular, they wanted to avoid spending money unnecessarily. They're most concerned to protect against shortages under future climate change, that is, water shortages. And that's a value. Climate information providers should be particularly concerned then about underestimating how much water supply might be reduced under climate change. Why? Because that would have particularly negative consequences. And while I've struggled here to figure out in the actual case how values were employed, what those stakeholders added to the conversation. The desire to manage inductive risk in this way might inform the selection of climate change scenarios, model projections, impact models, such that the upper end of the plausible range, essentially the worst case scenario, is the one that gets revealed to water managers, or at least we ensure that it is revealed to water managers in the various pieces of data that they are given. In this way, the values of the managers to protect against shortages are represented in the methodological decision that information providers make. What this study led to, in actuality, was an additional justification of a decision to build a lower level intake at Lake Mead. They found that many of their analyses of Lake Mead, the water level would in fact fall below the intakes, which would happen more and more frequently as time moved on and climate change or global warming occurred. Building a lower level intake could help ensure water security over a wider range of scenarios. So this is basically what we had envisioned. So this is the big takeaway from this paper in BAMS. Attending to inductive risk by working with users can help climate information providers account for social values in a responsible fashion. We actually thought that it would help them avoid the negative consequences, which were the most undesired by themselves and by those requesting the information. It would actually improve the science. So while I was writing this paper on user values with Wendy, I was trying to take a hard look at the problem of social values from a climate scientist standpoint. I was trying to find a way to help scientists responsibly appeal to social values without feeling as if they had to give up authority or legitimacy in the process. This is something that many had voiced to me, that they didn't like talking about social values or politics because it possibly jeopardized their place as a scientific authority. And I think for the most part, our proposal is successful in helping them by giving a model and how that might be done. However, as I pondered our proposal that user values should guide the provision of climate information, I also began to see things from a different perspective, that of the citizen, or perhaps their representatives. What I began to see is that the proposal to appeal to user values fit poorly with some conceptions of what democracy requires. And I'm now going to try and demonstrate what I mean. I'm going to problematize now my own view. Science performed in the absence of social values used to be the ideal. We used to think that science was completely value-free. Philosophers in science at least used to agree on this. While the dominant position now, by philosophers anyway, is that social values are permissible to handle inductive risk in some of the ways that I have specified, there are still those that argue otherwise. What is interesting, though, is that on both sides of this debate, there are those that believe the proper location for decision-making is within the realm of policy. It's within the positions occupied by democratically elected officials. For example, in dismissing the idea that science should be value-free, Heather Douglas claims, in particular, there are concerns over maintaining the proper locus for decision-making authority in the policy realm. These concerns arise because the ultimate source of political authority for any democratic government is the citizenry. Gregor Betz, while defending a completely different position that the value-free ideal should be upheld, says, as political decisions are informed by scientific findings, the value-free ideal ensures, in a democratic society, that collective goals are determined by democratically legitimized institutions and not by a handful of experts. And this need for political legitimacy, I think, leads to a problem. And to understand that problem, we need to understand the normative or prescriptive notion of political legitimacy. In a democracy like that of the United States, one could cash out this notion of political legitimacy in terms of social values. One might say that no set of social values may have an undue influence in coercive political decisions. That is, political institutions must permit at least the potential for equal influence on social decisions among its citizens. The problem is that allowing social values into things like climate risk analyses, one might violate this notion of legitimacy due to what I'm calling infiltration. If the social values of a particular few are embedded in the empirical justification of political decisions, right? If it's embedded in climate information, then democratic legitimacy is violated. There are values that are having an undue influence that are kind of snuck into the back door through the information that climate scientists are producing. What I mean by this is something like the following. In climate-related decision-making, climate-related data can have a significant influence over which course of action should be considered and which is ultimately selected. If only certain values are embedded in that information and other values are excluded from having that influence, then the decision will be made without the influence of these excluded social values. This would violate this notion of political legitimacy. It would violate the idea that there's equal influence among a variety of perspectives. Let me put this another way in hopes of making the point a bit clearer. It is not obvious that the user-engaged account that I have advocated for achieves political legitimacy. Consider this. Imagine an example where individual scientists choose values to break ties and unforced methodological decisions during the provision of climate information, and the information subsequently produced was used to create policy. Knowing that such a move is possible would give individual scientists substantial power in socially relevant science. They might be able to steer outcomes significantly and thus steer decision-making to their own ends or some ends unaligned with the public good. But scientists, they're not elected or democratically endorsed oftentimes. This would be an undue influence on the political process. So I hope you can see how this would happen if perhaps individual scientists were the locus of social value decision. Now, if we change the example and instead of scientist values, we appeal to user values, those that use the information, as the user-engaged account, which I helped develop, proposes, then we've just switched the origin of the undue influence from scientists to users. The problem remains, right? There's still a privileged set of values being used in the production of the information. Now you might think, oh, here on the screen we have a farmer using climate data via their tablet to make better crop planting and management decisions. This doesn't seem so bad. Where is the problem? But just change the example slightly again and pretend that the user is in fact a think tank that you politically disagree with. And the threat of social values having an undue influence on information for policy seems more menacing. After all, users really could be anyone. It could be anyone with the means to hire a scientist and put the resulting information into political decision making. This doesn't seem too legit. Now, just for a second, we can return to the possible answers to the question of whose values to employ. And we can include in this list of answers the user-engaged approach. But now, given the problem, which I think I've just described, one answer might stick out to you more than it did before, and that's this democratic view. Let's look at this view in a little bit more depth. This may not yet really be a cohesive view, but there's some appeal made to democratic institutions by many philosophers, including Heather Douglas, Philip Kitcher, Matt Brown, and Kristen Intamin, and of course my colleague Kevin Elliott. This view is often typified by an appeal to participatory or citizen science as a practical means of democratizing research, of legitimizing that research. But often this concern with legitimacy is around scientific integrity or the trustworthiness of science rather than a notion of normative political legitimacy, which is what I've given you. To explore in more depth, let's take a look at the most explicit articulation of the democratic view, which comes from Kristen Intamin. On her account, democracy is used to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate values. The democratic process, what it's supposed to do is pick out the aims of science, which then prescribes values to use in that science. And she formulates this view in particular for values in climate modeling. On this view, defining aims, the aims of science, helps pick out values. It is legitimate to appeal to values when they promote these democratically endorsed aims. Examples of aims are adapting the climate to a worst case scenario, protecting agriculture, and making climate predictions. Legitimacy for her comes in degrees. The more democratically endorsed aims are furthered, the more legitimate the values are. Values that do not forward aims or are irrelevant to doing so are illegitimate. And like others, participatory science shows the viability of this kind of project. Here's a diagram that visualizes how the democratically endorsed aims might guide scientific research. One can imagine this in the context of the Lake Mead case that I mentioned earlier. A representative body is formed to deliberate upon what the aims of the science study are. The deliberative body concludes that the aim should be to ensure water security. Given resource constraints, it would be democratically legitimate to employ data from the worst case scenario then in order to protect human livelihoods. Thus, when climate information providers are forced to choose between available rainfall projections, for example, the only legitimate choice is the worst case scenario, because that would further the aims that have been democratically established. This is very different from the way the user-engaged approach might be visualized. Rather than have an agreement on what the aims of science are, there are values of particular users that help produce science, and then this is fed into a policy discussion. One way to put this is that the user-engaged view has the politics on the back end, while the democratic view puts the politics right on the front end. What now seems clear is that there is a conflict between the user-engaged view of the provision of climate service information that I've developed so far and the democratic view of value use in science. The user-engaged view permits user values to influence the provision of information, whereas the democratic view mostly excludes it. So can this conflict be resolved? I should put up a signpost here. This is where we dive headfirst into work in progress. I'd be really happy to hear from the audience their thoughts on how I've set up this problem and in the sketch to come of how I deal with it. My intuition is that this conflict, it can be overcome. To do so, we need to examine what is meant by democratic endorsement and adopt a more sophisticated view of what democracy demands of science. What I'm aiming to do in this work that's still progressing is build an account of values in science based on deliberative democratic theory. Now, this might be new to many of you, but I'm going to give you a quick overview here. In deliberative democracy, members of the body politic come together to reason, engaging in deliberation about what would be good public ends. What deliberators do is they offer positions to each other. And these positions are those that could be justified to others who might reasonably disagree. Which position carries the day is supposed to be settled by the better argument. Ideally, deliberators would come to a consensus after reasoning with each other, but in practice, most times deliberation may be needed to end by a vote or some other mechanism to settle matters. There are ideals that regulate the deliberation process. Although not an exhaustive list, deliberation should operate with fairness, reciprocity, equality, and the absence of coercion. At least in the procedural form of deliberative democracy that I kind of ascribe to, the extent to which deliberation is guided by these ideals is proportional to the legitimacy of the outcome. This is definitely a normative and political form of legitimacy. Such a procedure, going through this kind of deliberation with these ideals approximate as much as possible, justifies authority over the final decision, even over those who've disagreed. It is then well-reasoned and informed deliberations that provide legitimacy on this view, right? It is the authority of the better argument which sanctions the positions that end up being enacted. Still, I think in order to make progress on the problem I've articulated, we need another tool from the political theorist toolbox. Obviously, we can't deliberate on everything all the time, so we need to appeal to the notion of a deliberative system, where labor is divided across different deliberative moments. Social labor in a democracy is divided. We don't have one kind of deliberation, we have many, right? So, I mean, we just had an election. We deliberated about who the president was, individual senators, many people at the state level, but also different propositions, many different things. We have a distributed system, and we've elected people who will then go on to have deliberations as our representatives in governmental bodies. To resolve the conflict I've identified here, we need to realize that the roles of values and the role of scientific information differs across these political moments. While these two approaches look different, what I want to claim is that they are actually modeling two different deliberative moments. The democratic view on the left models a deliberation about the aims or agendas of science. It is, however, a blunt tool, too blunt, really, for selecting which values to use in particular scientific projects. There can be many values that are consistent with democratically endorsed aims. User values are a very fine-grained tool. They appeal to the values of those that will be impacted or utilize this information, which then underwrites some of the policy, if this goes correctly. And I think that there is a way to model this as two different deliberative moments in the same system. This is the kind of picture I have in mind, though somewhat simplified. Deliberation is the mechanism by which democratic endorsement is secured in any given moment. So deliberation over our agenda or our aims on the left-hand side, that's the mechanism for deciding our aims, but it's also the mechanism for deciding our proposals, our policies that you see on the right-hand side. At some moments, one might deliberate over the aims of science as on the left. This will help specify a permissible range of values, right? It'll help specify the aims. Within that range, within the things that could fulfill those aims, the plurality of user and stakeholder values should guide the production of scientific information. Those with interests that are likely to be affected should have input at that point as much as possible. Then, when specific policy proposals are drawn up on the basis of that science, deliberators have access to the value-laden science to support their decisions and some transparency that the information produced was actually used specific values that were user-guided. And of course, this process can be iterated. Once user value-supported science is performed and policy implemented, that information can feed back into the deliberation over aims. And over time, the process repeats, hopefully refining people's positions or producing better science for particular aims. I think something like this picture fixes the shortcomings of both the democratic view and the user-engaged view. In the democratic view, the setting of aims of research seems too broad to specify which values to employ. There are, after all, many ways to help ensure water security. The user-engaged view seemingly puts malicious actors on par with good-intentioned ones. And by separating these into deliberative moments, this proposal diminishes the impact that those actors might have, because one, they are constrained by a particular set of aims, but two, they are flanked by, hopefully, additional information from different users' values perspectives. Sorry, that was a mouthful. So to conclude then, I believe that legitimacy can be furthered by combining the complementary advantages of these two views on whose values should guide uncertain methodological decisions in climate science. The democratic view says democratic aims should hold a privileged position in the course of climate science research. for many reasons, that does seem correct to me. Whereas the user engaged view allows for the individual expression of values within the production of climate science information, particularly by those who will be most affected by it, which also seems like a necessary component of any well-functioning democratic state. I believe, however, that we can have both. We just need to have a properly separated and well-structured set of deliberative moments. Thank you very much for listening. I very much look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Greg. Be sure to put your questions into the chat function or raise your hand, and I will make sure that I unmute you. So there is one question from Kevin, who says, that was a fantastic talk. I'd love to hear more about how you think the big democratic deliberations about the range of appropriate age should play out. Would this occur in citizen assemblies, or would policymakers do this? Or could social scientists engage in research that works with citizens to figure this out?
About the aims. Yeah. So how should that work out with aims? I tend to like the kind of mechanisms that James Fishkin, a deliberative democratic political theorist, proposes. So what he tends to propose are things that he calls mini publics. What they end up doing is they are ways of taking random samples of citizens, of participants, deliberative participants, and he puts them in instances where they are afforded information, access to experts, the ability to ask questions, etc., about about technical matters and about what our aims should be. And sometimes humanists and philosophers could be included in that group. And what I like about this is it takes a random sample of lay reasoners and provides them the information that they need to deliberate and puts them in a position to be able to deliberate. And then they offer prescriptive suggestions. And I think that this is at least one way, so this is like a social scientist essentially engaging in research, but I think this is one way to narrow down a significant number of options. It allows a kind of deliberation in the wild by narrowing these options down to ones that lay deliberators are likely to accept should they have all of the information necessary. And where we go from there, I'm not sure. I think that given that we do have representative bodies that we have elected to carry out these conversations, I think going to those bodies and having the discussion of the aims of science play out there with the backing of the social science research is probably the way to go. If things eventually occur outside of that, for example, in citizen assemblies, I question the legitimacy of such assemblies sometimes because they do not have this random sampling that the mini publics end up having. And so what you get is a lot of people who are simply interested in a particular topic because they've been personally affected by it. And their views should be included and they should be listened to. But eventually what I think is that they are simply, they tend to have too much sway. So legitimacy there can be questioned. So I believe we need to use the formal representative bodies that we've established in our government. And I think that there's a lot to say about how those could be better designed to handle both scientific information and to be more representative. But I think one way to ensure that they are as representative as possible is to do this kind of mini public social science research that like James Fishkin is doing. But I really like that question. Thank you.
We have a question from Casey Helgeson.
Hi, Greg. This is Casey. Thanks so much for the talk. I'm thinking about that last flow chart that you had on a slide, and I'm trying to get my head around still the idea of the two stages of values coming in. Mm-hmm. And so let me just say something that looks like it could happen in that flow chart, and you can tell me if it's wrong.
Sure.
it looked like in the democratic or deliberative process, this is, a way of aggregating people's sort of diverse or contested values into certain aims and goals. It looked like once that's done, at the next stage, people who sort of positions didn't win out in that aggregation, people who have idiosyncratic interests about what kind of information they want and what kind of errors they're afraid of. It looks like this picture could label those people's values and interests as sort of illegitimate at that point for influencing the science.
Mhm.
Is that right? Is that acceptable? Am I reading it wrong?
So I think that that's pretty close, and this is something that I'm definitely still toying with. The idea here is something like once there has been a sufficient kind of deliberation, and whether that's let's just assume that's about aims for the moment. Once that deliberation has been settled, you kind of need to reopen it at that level in order to change the outcome. So once we have our aims settled, then if you're proposing a set of values that we should use to fix our unforced methodological decisions, and that set of aims, and I mean that set of values doesn't speak to those aims, then that's just illegitimate. That's out of line at that point. The thing is, even once you have aims suitably defined, I think there's going to be a broad set of values that one could include within those aims as being justifiably, as needing to be justifiably explored under those aims. We can think of very conservative politicians that believe that they would much rather have, for example, economic mechanisms that create incentives to change environmental problems, right? And that's one way of doing something. And where, like, to what degree those incentives need to be, or I guess what I'm trying to say is something like there may be people whose values are not as extreme as others, and there may be people who value things like economic outcomes not greater than human life, but they may weigh it differently against human life, and that there is a lot of room once you define those aims to change those weights of particular values, because you're always going to have trade-offs. And I think that any instance where users have those particular values, any instance where you can trade off like that, you're going to want to represent those values as much as you can in your methodological decisions for producing scientific information. So then when we go to formulate a policy, we have a broad range of information that kind of spans, if you will, if you could produce that, spans the different values that would be appropriate to that aim. So then we can then have a suitable deliberation about that policy. Does that, I hope that answers your question, but like, I'm happy to address a follow-up to clarify.
No, that's definitely going in the right direction. I think further clarifying would just need working through like a concrete example, but that's not something that can be done on the fly.
Thank you very much, though. Great question.
And since I don't think everyone can see the comment, Kevin called our attention to an article in the recent issue of Science called Power to the People that talks about the kind of efforts by Fishkin that Greg just mentioned before, and involves examples with deliberation over climate risk management. So you might want to take a look at that because it's a nice fit with Greg's work. So Greg, I have a question for you, and that is what we do with value disagreements, and whether or not some of those value disagreements may not be resolvable through deliberative processes. I mean, I think that one thing I would add to your model is more iteration with the science, because I think once the science works with some of the identified values, going back to users with or publics with that information can actually start to shift decisions that users are making, and they may have additional questions that they need the scientists to offer insights concerning. But what do we do when either A, there are irreconcilable differences? I mean, that often happens in the political context. And B, what do we do about the fact that people's values change over time simply because current users hold certain values doesn't mean that future users hold the same values. So what do we do about, I've asked you two questions, but what do we do about future generations?
Well, I like very much the question about what do we do when users change their minds or when users themselves end up changing. Is I think that's a fascinating question, and I guess one of the answers is that I think here what I really like about climate services, for example, is that they are very motivated by giving, or they're very motivated to attempt to give information to what you might call grassroots level organizations.
Mhm.
So there's a broad attempt to create web portals that dispense information that anyone can sign up for, that you can go and then you can kind of like, essentially, they don't put it this way, but change the values that you're interested in to see new sets of data, to see the different consequences that might happen from that. And I think that this is kind of essential if you're going to hold a view like mine, that there is a quick, efficient ways for end users to actually go in and explore the way that the consequences might change, given what kinds of financial investments they might like to make, what kind of development they might like to have in a geographical area. I mean, you can think of a lot of different ways to do this. And that allows them to actually fool around and essentially change their mind. And it gives them ammunition, in a sense, to enter into political conversations well armed with their information. One of the biggest concerns that I have is that when we're talking about climate science information is it can be very hard to produce, right? I mean, many times you sometimes need a supercomputer to get this information out. And so if there's a certain set of values in there, it's not easy to go in and change them, or to see what it would be like if they were different or matched my values. But as climate services in these areas develop, I think people are recognizing, one, the value in doing it, but I also think there's a kind of responsibility on the part of scientists, given the democratic situation that we have, to make this information available to users such that they can see what their values would look like if they were embedded in this information, so they can use that in their deliberations. So that I hope that answers kind of like your second, what about these users changing question. The first one, what happens if there are irreconcilable differences? I mean, if I could solve that, we would be in a much nicer political situation. And I don't know what to say about that. I mean, my honest answer is actually, this is not necessarily where I think scientists, or maybe, I don't know to what extent this is true, but philosophers of science should be or have a lot to add. I mean, this is where I really think political theory needs to come and help us. And you might be able to tell from my project that that hasn't been done a lot in philosophy of science, where we don't have a kind of political philosophy of science. And that's what I'm trying to create. And it's what I'm finding is that it's just really hard. It's extremely hard. If you look at, I mean, mainstream political thinkers like Rawls, when he designs his systems, that there are just plain truths lying around that we can use in our deliberation. And like, okay, there are undisputed facts of medical and social science that we can draw on, and I don't know where these exist anymore, if they ever existed. Right? They're so fundamental, the facts, right? That you'd think that climate change would be one of those facts, but it's not, right? So in that situation, I'm not exactly sure what to do besides design better political institutions, and that's a whole different other project to go down. But I'm thinking about how philosophy of science and how political philosophy can better coexist and speak to each other in order to help answer those questions. But that's a big project.
Yes. it's a hard one. Thanks a lot, Greg. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I want to thank you for a very exciting talk. You've gotten us all thinking and given us a huge sort of charge for moving forward. I just want to end by encouraging people to continue watching for our speakers. We have a really good group of speakers next time to complement the amazing speakers we've already had. So keep an eye on the Rock Ethics Institute events page. And thanks, huge thanks to Professor Lusk for a very exciting talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. And if anyone has questions or want to talk, feel free to email me. It would be great to meet many of you.
Thanks a lot.